George Washington Carver died, but his seeds continued growing. The metaphor is not merely literary. The actual techniques he developed, the actual varieties he promoted, the actual understanding of soil and rotation that he advocated continued spreading long after his body returned to the earth he had loved. His legacy moved forward through channels visible and invisible, through the students who carried his teachings into the world, through the practices adopted by farmers who never knew his name, through the institutions built on foundations he helped lay. The Carver Research Foundation continued at Tuskegee, funding agricultural research, supporting students who followed in his footsteps, maintaining the connection between laboratory and field that had always been central to his work. The foundation embodied his vision that knowledge should serve those who need it most, that research should translate into practical benefit, that the gap between what science knows and what communities need should be closed through deliberate effort. His influence extended far beyond his specific discoveries. The extension service model that he and Tuskegee pioneered, bringing university knowledge directly to rural communities, became a national institution through the Smith-Lever Act and the Cooperative Extension Service. Every county extension agent who visits a farm today, every university-sponsored agricultural program that reaches beyond campus walls carries forward something that Carver helped create: the emphasis on crop rotation, on soil health, on sustainable agriculture found new expression in movements he did not live to see: the organic farming revival, the concern for sustainable food systems, the growing recognition that industrial agriculture's short-term productivity comes at long-term cost. Carver's message that the earth is not an infinite resource to be extracted, but a living system requiring reciprocity, sounds remarkably contemporary, speaks to concerns that have become more urgent with each passing decade. But his legacy is also contested. Carver has been used, sometimes misused, by those seeking to make various arguments about race and achievement in America. During his lifetime and after, he was held up by some as proof that individual effort could overcome racism, a message that blamed Black poverty on Black people rather than on the systems that produced and maintained it. He was presented as an acceptable Black man, one who did not challenge white supremacy directly, one who worked within the system rather than seeking to overthrow it. The critique has merit. Carver did not organize protests or march for civil rights. His relationship with Booker T. Washington tied him to an accommodationist approach that other Black leaders rejected. His gentle demeanor, his refusal to confront racism aggressively, his willingness to accept the praise of white Americans who denied rights to Black Americans, all of this can be criticized, can be seen as complicity rather than resistance. Yet the critique may also be incomplete. Carver's quiet work, teaching Black farmers to be self-sufficient, demonstrating Black scientific capability that could not be denied, building institutions that served Black communities when no one else would, was its own form of resistance. His refusal to patent discoveries, his insistence that knowledge belonged to everyone, his lifetime of service to the poorest and most forgotten. These were political acts, were challenges to a system that valued profit over people, were assertions of values that the dominant culture did not share. Perhaps both things are true. Perhaps Carver was both limited by the conditions of his time and effective within those conditions. Perhaps his approach worked for what it was and also fell short of what was needed. Perhaps his legacy is neither purely positive nor purely negative, but simply human, complicated, contradictory, worthy of both appreciation and critique. What cannot be denied is the influence. The agricultural techniques persist. The institutional models endure. The students he taught spread his teachings across generations. The correspondence he maintained touched lives we cannot count. The products he developed, though often superseded by newer innovations, demonstrated possibilities that changed how people thought about agriculture and race and achievement. The seeds he planted continue growing in soil we cannot see, in gardens we do not tend, in harvests we will never count. The man who learned to listen to plants taught others to listen too, taught them that abundance exists where others see scarcity, that possibility waits where others see only limitation, that the earth speaks to anyone patient enough to hear. The legacy is unfinished, is always unfinished. Each generation receives what previous generations planted and must decide what to do with the inheritance. Carver's seeds grow still, but whether they flourish or wither depends on whether we tend them, whether we continue the work, whether we learn to listen as he learned to listen. The garden waits. The soil waits. The seeds wait for those who will carry them forward. For nearly 2 decades, George Washington Carver wandered. The wandering was not aimless. It was pulled by a constant star, the desire for education that burned in him with an intensity that poverty could not diminish and rejection could not extinguish. But the path to that star was blocked again and again by the architecture of American racism, by doors that opened and then closed the moment that his skin was seen. He left the Carver farm around 1876, a boy of perhaps 12 or 13, walking toward a school for black children in Neosho, Missouri, 8 miles away, far enough to require leaving everything familiar behind. He found lodging with a black couple, Mariah and Andrew Watkins, who took in the homeless child and gave him what the Carvers had given: a room, a garden, and encouragement. Mariah Watkins was a midwife and herbalist, and in her, George found confirmation of what he had learned in Diamond Grove, that plants held healing powers, that the green world offered remedies to those who knew how to ask. The school in Neosho was rudimentary, but George absorbed its lessons like parched earth receiving rain. He quickly outpaced his classmates, exhausted what the small institution could teach, and understood that he must move on again. The pattern would repeat throughout his youth, arriving somewhere, learning everything available, discovering that more lay beyond. moving toward the next possibility. He drifted across Kansas in the late 1870s and early 1880s, supporting himself through whatever work he could find: cooking, laundering, farming, housekeeping. He attended school when he could, worked when he must, accumulated knowledge in fragments between the necessities of survival. In Fort Scott, Kansas, he witnessed a black man lynched by a white mob, dragged from jail, beaten, burned alive while the crowd watched. The horror of that night marked him. He left Fort Scott and never returned, carrying with him the knowledge of what his country was capable of, what his skin made him vulnerable to, what violence waited beneath the surface of even ordinary days. Yet he persisted. The wandering continued through Minneapolis, Kansas, where he finally completed high school, where he was the only black student, where he excelled despite or because of his difference. And then, at last, he applied to Highland College in Kansas, was accepted, received the letter that seemed to promise everything he had worked toward, prepared to begin the formal higher education that had been denied him for so long. The door of Highland College opened. George arrived, and then the door closed. The president of the Highland College, upon seeing that the applicant was black, rescinded the acceptance. There had been a mistake, he explained. Highland College did not accept colored students. The letter had been sent in error. George Washington Carver was welcome to seek education elsewhere. Elsewhere. The word echoes through the following years, through the rejection that might have broken a lesser spirit, through the wilderness that followed. Carver homesteaded alone on the Kansas prairie, proved up his claim, planted crops in the harsh land, lived in solitude that was sometimes chosen and sometimes imposed. He developed his artistic talents, painting flowers with such precision and beauty that art teachers would later marvel. He learned to see the world through multiple lenses: scientific and aesthetic, practical and spiritual, all of them focused on the natural world he loved. And eventually, hesitantly, he tried again. Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa, accepted him in 1890. The only black student, once more, in an institution that had no idea what to do with him, but could not deny his obvious gifts. His art instructor, recognizing both his talent and his limitations in a society that would never buy paintings from a black man, encouraged him to pursue science instead. Agriculture, perhaps, the growing things he had loved since childhood. Carver transferred to Iowa State Agricultural College in 1891. He became the first black student to earn a bachelor's degree there, then the first to earn a master's degree, then the first to be invited to join the faculty. The greenhouse he managed flourished under his care. His research on plant diseases earned recognition. The boy who had been turned away from Highland College, who had wandered homeless across the Great Plains, who had supported himself through laundry work and odd jobs for 2 decades. This man was now Professor Carver, respected scientist, valued colleague. But something had happened during those wandering years that academic credentials could not capture. Carver had learned to survive rejection without surrendering his dignity, had learned to persist without becoming bitter, had developed a spiritual practice that sustained him through loneliness and hardship, rising before dawn, walking alone in nature, conducting conversations with God that he described as the source of his creativity and insight. The man who emerged from those wandering years was not merely educated, but formed, not merely credentialed, but deepened, not merely successful, but wise. The gates that had locked against him had forced him to find other paths. The doors that closed had led him to windows. The rejection had not made him hard, but had somehow made him gentle, as if the repeated experience of being denied had taught him compassion for all who were denied, had connected him to suffering that transcended his individual experience. And then, in 1896, a letter arrived from Alabama. Booker T. Washington, founder of Tuskegee Institute, wrote to this promising young scientist with an invitation that was also a summons. Come south. Come help your people. Come teach farmers how to heal the wounded land. The wandering years were ending. The locked gates were behind him. And ahead lay a destination that the wandering itself had prepared him for. A place where everything he had learned through rejection and persistence and solitary prayer would finally find its purpose. Carver considered the offer. Iowa State offered security, resources, a greenhouse already flourishing, a position already established. Tuskegee offered uncertainty, poverty, a department that did not yet exist, equipment that would have to be scavenged from trash heaps, students who had never held a microscope. He chose Tuskegee, chose the harder path, chose to take his knowledge to those who needed it most, rather than to those who could most easily use it. The wanderer was about to arrive. The gates were about to open, and in Alabama, the exhausted fields waited for someone who understood that healing begins with listening. In the hush of closing, we return to where we began, to a child in a Missouri garden, listening to flowers, learning a language older than human speech. George Washington Carver's life was a long conversation with the living world, a dialogue between curiosity and creation that death did not end, but only transformed. The conversation continues still, in every garden where someone kneels to tend, in every field where someone asks what the soil needs, in every quiet moment when a human being attends to the voices of growing things. What did Carver hear in those pre-dawn hours when he walked alone among the plants? The question has no answer we can verify. He described conversations with God, described receiving revelations about his research, described methods that were revealed rather than discovered. Whether these descriptions were literal or metaphorical, whether something genuinely unusual happened in his consciousness, or whether he was simply articulating ordinary creativity in spiritual terms, these questions cannot be settled by evidence we possess, but the fruits of those conversations can be seen. The 300 products from the peanut, the 100 products from the sweet potato, the soil restoration techniques, the extension education model, the lives touched through teaching and correspondence and quiet example, all of these emerged from a consciousness that approached nature with reverence, that believed the earth contained messages waiting to be decoded, that practiced science as a form of prayer. The invitation his life extends is not to believe what he believed, not necessarily to share his theology or his methods or his understanding of how knowledge is received. The invitation is to approach the natural world with the same humility he brought to it, to recognize that we are not masters of the earth, but participants in a system we did not create and do not fully understand, to listen for what the world wishes to teach, rather than merely extracting what we wish to take. The crisis of our time is partly a crisis of listening, of industrial systems that cannot hear the earth's distress, of economic structures that value extraction over reciprocity, of human activity that proceeds as if the natural world were merely resource rather than relationship. Carver's life offers an alternative, a way of engaging with nature that begins with attention, that proceeds through patience, that yields knowledge not through conquest, but through conversation. The peanut still grows. The sweet potato still offers its possibilities. The soil still speaks to those who learn to hear. The conversation that Carver began in a Missouri garden, that he continued for nearly 80 years through laboratories and fields and correspondence and quiet pre dawn walks, that conversation remains open, inviting us to continue what he began, to learn what he learned, to listen as he listened. The night deepens around us now. The modern world, with its noise and haste, grows distant, and in the quiet that remains, we can almost hear what Carver heard, the whisper of growing things, the patient voice of soil, the ancient dialogue between seed and earth that has continued since life first stirred in primordial waters. The child who was traded for a horse learned to listen. The wanderer who was turned away from every door learned to persist. The scientist who had nothing built a laboratory from salvage and discovered what the wealthy had missed. The man who might have sought fame and fortune chose instead to serve, to teach, to give away everything he had learned. His life poses a question that his death does not answer. What grows from the seeds we plant? And what soil are we preparing for those who come after? The gardens wait. The conversation continues. And somewhere in the space between night and dawn, between memory and possibility, between what was and what might be, the voice of George Washington Carver whispers still, patient, gentle, certain that the earth will speak to anyone who knows how to listen. Sleep now. Let the garden settle into darkness. Let the seeds rest in soil that remembers everything, and wake remembering that the conversation never ends, that the listening is always possible, that the earth still speaks to those who have the patience and the humility to hear. the child in the garden, the scientist in the laboratory, the teacher in the field, the correspondent answering letters by lamplight, the elder walking among plants at dawn, all one, all continuous, all still present in every moment when a human being kneels in soil and asks what it needs, what it contains, what it wishes to become. The peanut, the sweet potato, the wounded land, the healed relationship. George Washington Carver, forever listening, forever teaching us to listen, forever. Conclusion, where seeds become stars, the dawn scrolls close, the chronicle of one life, humble in its origins, profound in its impacts, ends not with conclusions, but with continuations. For George Washington, Carver's story does not end with his death any more than a seed story ends with its planting. What he began continues in the growth that followed, in the harvests we still gather, in the conversations we still might join, if we learn to listen as he learned to listen. We have walked with him through the gardens of his childhood, through the wandering years when every door closed against him, through the persistence that finally opened those doors, through the letter that called him south to his destiny. We have entered his laboratory of salvaged equipment and sacred purpose, have ridden with the wagon that carried education to those who could not reach it, have stood in the halls of Congress as a soft spoken scientist, held powerful men transfixed. We have read the letters he wrote to the lonely and lost, have watched him in the garden of his evening years, have followed his seeds as they continued growing long after his body returned to the earth he loved. We have contemplated his legacy, its complications and its contributions, its uses and its misuses, its continuing relevance to a world that still struggles to hear what the earth is trying to teach. What remains? Not answers, but questions. Not certainty, but invitation. Not a finished story, but an ongoing conversation. The earth still speaks. The soil still remembers. The relationship between humanity and the natural world still requires attention, still demands reciprocity, still offers abundance to those who approach it with the humility and patience that Carver exemplified. Sleep now. Let the night gather its darkness around you, and as you drift toward dreams, remember the child in the Missouri garden, frail, orphaned, traded for a horse, who learned that plants would speak to anyone who knew how to listen. Remember the man he became, patient, persistent, devoted to service, who translated what he heard into knowledge that transformed lives. The conversation continues in every garden, in every field, in every moment when curiosity overcomes haste and listening replaces extraction. There the conversation continues, and somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, between memory and possibility, George Washington Carver waits, ready to welcome anyone who joins the dialogue, anyone who learns to hear what the earth has always been saying. The peanut holds its secrets still. The soil waits for those who will tend it. The seeds dream of becoming what they contain. And in the darkness, In the quiet, in the place where all stories end and begin, something grows, patient, persistent, reaching toward light we cannot yet see, carrying forward the hope that sustained one gentle man through a lifetime of service. The dawn comes, the gardens wake, and the conversation, that ancient, sacred, enduring conversation between humanity and earth, continues still. Sleep well and wake remembering. When George Washington Carver arrived at Tuskegee Institute in October 1896, he found no laboratory waiting, no gleaming equipment, no organized specimens, no shelves lined with the tools of scientific inquiry. He found instead a single room, empty of everything except possibility, rich only in the need that had called him south. The contrast with Iowa State could not have been starker. There, Carver had worked with proper equipment, microscopes manufactured for the purpose, glassware designed for experiments, instruments calibrated to scientific standards. Here, he found nothing. Tuskegee Institute was young, was poor, was building itself from almost nothing in a region that wanted it to fail. The resources that northern universities took for granted did not exist. The funding that supported research elsewhere had not materialized. But Carver had learned from poverty, had learned during the wandering years that necessity could be transmuted into invention, that absence could become presence through persistence and imagination. He looked at the empty room and saw not what it lacked, but what it might become. He sent his students into the fields and trash heaps of Macon County with instructions to bring back anything that might be useful. They returned with broken bottles that could be cut into beakers and flasks, with tin cans that could be hammered into containers, with discarded pots and pans that could serve as crucibles, with wire and wood and rubber that could be fashioned into apparatus. From the refuse of the surrounding community, Carver and his students built a laboratory. The resourcefulness was both practical and pedagogical. Carver understood that his students, many of them the children and grandchildren of enslaved people, most of them from families with nothing, needed to learn that poverty was not an obstacle to achievement. They needed to see that scientific inquiry did not require expensive equipment, that understanding could be pursued with whatever materials were at hand, that the barriers they had been taught to accept as insurmountable could be overcome through creativity and determination. The laboratory they built together became a testament to that lesson. Rubber bands were transformed into Bunsen burners. Ink bottles became test tubes. The salvaged and the discarded were given new purpose, new dignity, new possibility. What prestigious universities might have accomplished with thousands of dollars, Tuskegee accomplished with almost nothing, not because Carver was a miracle worker, but because he refused to accept that lack of resources meant lack of possibility. He called the space God's little workshop, and in that naming revealed the theology that guided all his scientific work. For Carver, there was no separation between sacred and secular, between worship and research, between the laboratory and the sanctuary. The plants he studied were not merely specimens, but communications from the Creator, messages waiting to be decoded, secrets waiting to be revealed, lessons waiting to be learned. Science, in his understanding, was not the replacement of religion, but its extension, not the enemy of faith, but its instrument. Each morning, before the campus stirred, before the students arrived, before the day's demands began, Carver rose in darkness and walked alone among the plants. These pre-dawn hours were his time of communion with nature, with God, with whatever it was that spoke to him in the silence between night and day. He described these walks as conversations, as consultations, as sessions in which he asked questions and received answers. I never have to grope for methods, he later explained. The method is revealed at the moment I am inspired to create something new. What happened during those solitary walks remains beyond our knowing. Whether Carver experienced literal inspiration, whether ideas arrived fully formed from some source beyond his conscious mind, whether the description he offered were metaphor rather than literal truth, these questions have no answers we can verify. What we know is that he emerged from those pre-dawn hours with insights that would transform his laboratory work, with approaches to problems that seemed to come from nowhere and yet proved effective, with a clarity of purpose that sustained him through decades of difficult labor. The laboratory itself became a space of transformation. Students who had never seen a microscope learned to use one, learned not just the technique, but the philosophy, the patient observation, the willingness to look closely at what most people ignored. They learned to see abundance where others saw only lack, to find uses for what others had discarded, to approach the natural world with curiosity rather than mere utility. And in that laboratory of dust and devotion, Carver began the work that would make him famous. He studied the crops that black farmers could grow instead of cotton, peanuts and sweet potatoes and cowpeas, nitrogen-fixing legumes that would restore what cotton had depleted. He experimented with these humble plants, interrogated them, asked what they might become, listened for answers that came in the language of chemistry and possibility. The peanut became his primary focus, though not initially. The peanut was a crop that farmers could grow, that the soil needed them to grow, that rotation demanded they grow. But the peanut had a problem. No one wanted to buy it. The markets knew cotton. The merchants would accept cotton against credit. The entire economic system of the South was organized around cotton. Growing peanuts was scientifically sound, but economically problematic. Farmers who planted peanuts instead of cotton would have crops they could not sell, would be worse off than before. Carver understood that agricultural reform required economic reform, that teaching farmers to rotate crops meant creating markets for those crops, that healing the land required creating value from what the healed land would produce. And so the real work began, not just studying the peanut, but transforming it, not just understanding its properties, but demonstrating its possibilities, not just recommending rotation, but making rotation profitable. In God's little workshop, surrounded by equipment salvaged from trash heaps, guided by conversations conducted in pre-dawn darkness, George Washington Carver began to ask the peanut what it wished to become. The answers would astound the world. In his final years, George Washington Carver moved slowly through the gardens of Tuskegee, his body failing even as his spirit remained devoted to the growing things he had loved all his life. The years of labor had worn him down. The frailty that had marked his childhood returned to claim his age. But those who saw him in those twilight years remembered him still walking among the plants at dawn, still pausing to examine a leaf, still listening for whatever the green world wished to tell him. The honors accumulated as his health declined. The Roosevelt Medal for Outstanding Contribution to Southern Agriculture, election to the Royal Society of Arts in London, invitations to speak that came from across the country and around the world, most of which he had to decline because his body could no longer sustain the travel. The boy who had been traded for a horse was now among the most celebrated scientists in America, his face recognized everywhere, his name synonymous with agricultural innovation. But Carver seemed puzzled by the fame, uncomfortable with the attention, interested only in continuing the work that had always been his focus. When visitors arrived to meet the famous Peanut Man, they found not a celebrity basking in recognition, but a humble scientist still working in his laboratory, still corresponding with farmers, still rising before dawn to walk among the plants. He donated his life savings to establish the George Washington Carver Research Foundation at Tuskegee. Approximately $60,000 accumulated through decades of frugal living. The money would support agricultural research for generations to come, would ensure that the work would continue after he was gone. The donation was characteristic. Carver had never sought wealth, had refused to patent his discoveries, had given away everything he had learned. Giving away his money was simply the final expression of a life devoted to service. The last years were filled with visitors, pilgrims, really, who came to Tuskegee to meet Carver before it was too late. Presidents and industrialists, scientists and students, famous and unknown, they made their way to Alabama to sit with the elderly man, to hear his soft voice, to receive whatever wisdom he might impart. He received them all with the same gentle courtesy, the same humble presence, the same evident faith that had sustained him through everything. His religious convictions deepened as death approached. He spoke more frequently of returning to the Creator who had given him his gifts, of joining the communion of plants and souls that transcended individual existence. His faith had never been conventional, had always mingled science and spirituality, had always seen research as a form of prayer, and as death neared, that faith became even more explicit, even more central to everything he said. I never knew a moment of despair, he reportedly told a visitor In his final weeks, I did not know what despair was. I had something inside that kept me going when there was nothing outside to help. The something inside had carried him through slavery's aftermath, through the rejection at Highland College, through the wandering years, through decades of patient labor in a salvaged laboratory. It had sustained him through loneliness and fame, through poverty and recognition, through everything that life had offered and demanded. And now it was carrying him toward the doorway that waited for everyone. The transition he did not fear because he believed it was return rather than departure. He fell in his room on January 5th, 1943, had been found by a colleague, was carried to the hospital, was recognized as dying. His last words were reported variously. Some say he spoke of God, some say he spoke of his work, some say he simply slipped away in silence. What is certain is that by evening he was gone. His body finally surrendered. His spirit departed toward whatever awaited beyond. The news traveled across the country, across the world. The former slave's son, who had become one of America's most celebrated scientists, was dead. Obituaries appeared in newspapers everywhere, summarizing a life that could not really be summarized, measuring achievements that could not really be measured, honoring a man whose significance exceeded any accounting that words could provide. He was buried on the Tuskegee campus, near the laboratory where he had worked for 47 years, in the soil he had taught his students to love and understand. The grave is simple, a marker bearing his name and dates, his title and brief description. Nothing elaborate, nothing grand, nothing that would have made him uncomfortable. The gardens he tended still grow. The laboratory still stands, now a museum. The work continues. The Carver Research Foundation still supports agricultural research. Students still learn the lessons he taught. Farmers still practice the techniques he pioneered. The seeds he planted continue yielding harvests he will never see. And somewhere in the dawn light over Tuskegee, in the hush before the campus stirs, something lingers. A presence, perhaps a whisper, the echo of a man who walked among plants each morning, asking questions and receiving answers. The gardens remember, the soil remembers, and those who walk there in the quiet hours before sunrise sometimes feel that they are not alone, that someone is still listening for what the earth wishes to teach. Within the humble architecture of a peanut shell, George Washington Carver found a universe, not metaphorically, literally. The peanut contained proteins and oils, carbohydrates and vitamins, compounds that could be separated and recombined, transformed and transmuted, turned into substances no one had imagined could emerge from such a simple source. The number would eventually reach over 300 different products derived from the peanut, each one discovered in that salvaged laboratory at Tuskegee, each one documented and published and offered to the world. The list reads like a catalog of impossibilities: peanut milk and cream and cheese, peanut coffee and peanut flour, dyes in colors ranging from black to purple to deep red, wood stains that protected and beautified, face creams and hand lotions, insulating board and paper, axle grease and linoleum, plastics and rubbers, medicines and livestock feeds. How did he do it? The question was asked often during his lifetime and has been asked since. Carver's own answer was disarmingly simple. He asked the peanut what it wished to become, and he listened for answers. I never have to grope for methods, he explained. The method is revealed at the moment I am inspired to create something new. The explanation satisfied some and frustrated others. Scientists accustomed to methodical procedures, to hypotheses tested and revised, to the slow accumulation of knowledge through systematic experiment. These scientists struggled with Carver's description of his process. Was he being metaphorical? Was he mystifying procedures that were actually conventional? Or was something genuinely unusual happening in his consciousness? Some form of insight or inspiration that transcended ordinary scientific method? The answer may be that Carver's approach was both scientific and mystical, both methodical and intuitive, both grounded in careful observation and open to insights that seemed to arrive from elsewhere. He kept laboratory notebooks, documented his experiments, followed the procedures of conventional research. But he also prayed before working, rose before dawn to walk among plants and speak with God, approached his research as a form of spiritual practice rather than merely technical procedure. The theology was consistent with his understanding of nature as divine text, of plants as communications from the Creator, of science as the discipline of learning to read what God had written. The peanut contained possibilities that the Creator had placed there. Carver's task was to discover those possibilities, to decode the message, to reveal what had been intended but not yet realized. Whether this understanding was literally true, whether the peanut actually contained 300 products waiting to be discovered, or whether Carver's creativity imposed possibilities that were not inherently present, is a question that cannot be answered from within science itself. What can be said is that Carver's approach, whatever its ultimate source, proved remarkably productive. The products accumulated, the list grew, the peanut revealed itself as something far more than anyone had imagined. The products served multiple purposes. Some were directly useful to the poor farmers Carver sought to help. Peanut milk for families who could not afford cow's milk, peanut meal for livestock feed, doses that could be made from materials available in any rural community. Others were arguments for the peanut industry, demonstrations that the crop had commercial value, that markets could be created, that growing peanuts made economic sense. But Carver did not pursue the commercial potential for his own benefit. He refused to patent his discoveries, believing that knowledge should be freely shared, that the Creator's gifts should not be hoarded. The decision cost him financially. Other scientists became wealthy from discoveries less significant than his. But it was consistent with his understanding of his mission. He had come to Tuskegee to help his people, not to enrich himself. The products he discovered belonged to everyone who needed them. The sweet potato received similar attention. From that humble tuber, Carver extracted over 100 products: flour and starch, vinegar and molasses, synthetic rubber and library paste. The methodology was the same: patient investigation, spiritual listening, the combination of rigorous experiment and intuitive insight that characterized all his work. The pecans of Alabama, the clays of Macon County, the wild plants that grew in fields and forests, all of these became subjects of Carver's investigation. All of them revealed possibilities that had gone unnoticed. All of them testified to his conviction that abundance was everywhere, waiting to be discovered by those who knew how to look. His laboratory became a pilgrimage site of sorts. Visitors traveled to Tuskegee to see the famous Peanut Man at work, to watch him demonstrate his discoveries, to hear him explain his methods in the soft voice that never rose in anger or pride. He received them with characteristic humility, showing them the salvaged equipment, the products lined up on shelves, the notebooks documenting years of patient labor. The contrast between the man and his achievements was striking. Carver remained throughout his life modest, gentle, dressed in simple clothes, uninterested in the fame that increasingly surrounded him. The genius who had unlocked the peanut's secrets seemed genuinely puzzled by the attention, seemed to view his work not as personal achievement, but as transmission, as passing along what he had received, as revealing what the Creator had placed within the plants for humanity to discover. The 300 products were arguments, were demonstrations, were evidence offered to a world that needed convincing. They testified that the peanut was valuable, that rotation was possible, that the wounded fields of the South could be healed without destroying the farmers who worked them. They represented years of labor, countless experiments, the patient persistence that scientific discovery requires. But perhaps more important than any individual product was the demonstration itself, the proof that possibilities existed everywhere, that abundance could be found in what others had dismissed, that poverty need not be permanent if only one knew where and how to look. The peanut held 300 secrets because Carver had asked it 300 questions, had listened for 300 answers, had refused to accept that anything was merely what it appeared to be. The shells piled up in his laboratory, each one emptied of its contents, each one testament to what patient investigation could reveal. And George Washington Carver, surrounded by his salvaged equipment and his accumulated discoveries, continued working, continued asking, continued listening, continued believing that the Creator had more to reveal to anyone humble enough to receive it. In the soft darkness of a Missouri night, sometime around 1860, the exact date lost to the chaos of slavery and war, a child wandered into gardens while others slept. His name was George, though he would not carry a surname until after freedom came, would not be Washington Carver until Moses and Susan Carver, the German immigrant couple who owned him and then raised him, gave him their family name along with something resembling love. The child had been born into bondage on the Carver farm near Diamond Grove, Missouri. His father, a slave on a neighboring property, died before George drew his first breath, killed in a logging accident. His body returned to earth before his son arrived upon it. His mother, Mary, worked in the Carver household, tending the farm while the Civil War tore the nation apart. When George was perhaps an infant, perhaps a few months old, the records do not say, could not say, for slaves were not deemed worthy of precise documentation. Night riders swept through the region, stealing valuable human property to sell in the chaos of the collapsing Confederacy. They took Mary. They took George. Moses Carver sent a neighbor to track the raiders. The neighbor found only George, sick, abandoned, perhaps too ill to sell, perhaps too young to bring a price. Mary was never seen again. Her fate dissolves into the darkness of that violent time. Another black mother swallowed by the machinery of bondage. Another absence that would echo through her son's life forever. The neighbor brought George back. Moses Carver paid for the child's return with a racehorse worth $300, the price of a sickly infant in the calculus of that terrible age. And so George came to be raised by the Carvers, not as slave, but not quite as family, occupying a liminal space that would characterize much of his life. He was free now, though freedom meant little to a child with no parents, no property, no protection beyond the goodwill of those who had once owned him. The illness that had made him worthless to the raiders left permanent marks. George's voice would always carry a high, soft quality, the result, perhaps, of respiratory infections that scarred his throat. His body remained frail throughout his childhood, unsuited for the heavy labor that was expected of black children in that time and place. Susan Carver, recognizing that the boy could not work the fields, assigned him instead to the household and the gardens. And there, among the growing things, George discovered something that would shape the entire arc of his existence. He had a gift. The neighbors noticed it first, how the plants in his care flourished while identical plant elsewhere struggled, how he seemed to understand what each specimen needed without being told, how his small hands moved among leaves and stems with a tenderness that seemed almost devotional. They began calling him the plant doctor, bringing their ailing specimens to this child who could not read or write, who had no formal education, who possessed only an inexplicable communion with the green world. What did George perceive that others could not? The question has no easy answer. He would later describe his relationship with plants in terms that blurred the boundary between science and mysticism, between observation and revelation. He spoke of asking plants questions and receiving answers. He spoke of nature as a book written by God, each leaf a page, each flower a chapter in a vast text that most humans never learned to read. Whether this was metaphor or method, whether Carver meant these descriptions literally or poetically, remains one of the gentle mysteries surrounding his life. But something undeniably happened in those Missouri gardens. A child who had been stripped of everything: mother, father, health, freedom, found in the plant world a relationship that no human institution could take away. The gardens became his sanctuary, his school, his first laboratory. He learned to identify plants by their leaves and roots, learned to recognize the signs of disease and deficiency, learned to see patterns that his eyes had somehow been made to see. Susan Carver taught him to read from an old spelling book, and George absorbed the letters with the same hunger he brought to the gardens. But there was no school for black children in Diamond Grove, no institution that would admit him, no pathway to the formal education he craved. The knowledge he accumulated in those early years came from the gardens themselves, from the patient instruction of growing things, from a curriculum that had no name and granted no credentials. By the time he was 10 or 11, George had learned all that Diamond Grove could teach him. The Carvers supported his desire for education, understood that this unusual child needed something they could not provide. And so George Washington Carver, taking the surname of those who had owned him and then raised him, carrying nothing but a few clothes and a burning desire to learn, left the only home he had known and walked into the larger world. He walked toward schoolhouses that would turn him away, toward years of poverty and odd jobs and doors that closed the moment he approached, toward a destiny he could not imagine that began in the silence of a Missouri garden where a child first learned that plants would speak to anyone who knew how to listen. The gardens of Diamond Grove are long gone now. The exact location of the Carver farm dissolves into the general landscape of southwestern Missouri, marked only by monuments erected later, visited by those who wish to stand where genius first stirred. But the gardens themselves, the actual plants that George tended, the specific flowers he pressed between pages, the seeds he saved, these have returned to earth, have completed their cycles, have become soil from which other things grow. What remains is the story, the beginning, the child who had nothing and found everything in the conversation between his hands and the breathing green world, the plant doctor of Diamond Grove, walking alone at twilight, listening for voices that only he could hear. The night deepens, the gardens wait, and somewhere in the darkness, between memory and forgetting, a frail child kneels in soil, his hands blackened with earth, his eyes closed as if in prayer, conducting the first sacraments of a life that would be devoted always to listening. In January 1921, George Washington Carver traveled to Washington, D.C. to testify before the House Ways and Means Committee. He carried with him a case full of peanut products, notes for a presentation, and the quiet dignity that had carried him through 6 decades of American racism. He was given 10 minutes to speak. He spoke for nearly 2 hours, and when he finished, the congressmen, some of whom had never listened to a black man speak with such authority, rose to applaud. The occasion was a tariff hearing. The United Peanut Association of America sought protection from cheap Chinese peanut imports that threatened domestic producers. Carver had been invited to testify about the peanut's value, about the products that could be derived from it, about the industry's importance to American agriculture. It was technical testimony about trade policy, the kind of hearing that rarely drew attention or audiences. But something happened in that committee room that transcended tariff rates and import duties. Something happened when a soft spoken black man from Alabama stood before powerful white legislators and demonstrated what genius looked like, what dignity looked like, what knowledge in the service of his people looked like. Carver began his presentation and quickly exceeded his allotted time. The chairman of the committee, initially dismissive, "I suppose if you have plenty of peanuts and watermelons, you are perfectly happy," he had remarked at the start, became first attentive, then fascinated, then visibly moved by what he was witnessing. He granted extension after extension, allowed Carver to continue well beyond what protocol permitted. From his case, Carver drew product after product, peanut milk and cream, dyes in brilliant colors, face powder and cooking oils, wood stains and breakfast foods. Each product was held up, explained, demonstrated. Each was another argument for the peanut's value, another reason to protect the industry, another piece of evidence that this simple legume contained possibilities no one had imagined. The congressman laughed at first, nervous laughter, the kind that white men often employed when confronted with black excellence they could not dismiss. But the laughter faded as the demonstration continued, as the products kept emerging, as the impossibility of what they were witnessing became undeniable. This elderly black man in his plain suit, speaking so softly that some had to lean forward to hear, was teaching them something they had not known, revealing a world they had not seen. The peanut has been classified as a food, Carver explained at one point. But that doesn't tell the story. It has within it the possibility of becoming many things we have never dreamed of. The words could have described Carver himself, classified by the society as merely a black man, as merely a former slave son, as merely a teacher at a small southern college, yet containing possibilities that society had never dreamed of. The testimony was about peanuts, but it was also about something else, about what black Americans could achieve when given the chance, about what the nation lost when it denied opportunity to millions of its citizens, about the gap between what was and what might be. When Carver finished, the chairman, who had begun with watermelon jokes, concluded with admiration. "Dr. Carver, I think you are one of the most remarkable men we have ever had before this committee." The applause that followed was genuine, was earned, was acknowledgement of something that the congressman could not quite name, but could not deny. The tariff passed. The peanut industry received its protection, but the testimony's significance extended far beyond trade policy. Newspapers across the country reported on the peanut man who had captivated Congress, who had demonstrated black achievement that could not be ignored, who had spoken truth to power without raising his voice or surrendering his dignity. The testimony made Carver famous, or rather, made him famous to white America, which had not previously paid much attention. In black communities, he was already celebrated. The congressional testimony simply introduced him to a wider audience, brought national attention to work that had been quietly transforming the South for 2 decades. But the fame was complicated. Carver was celebrated by some as proof that black Americans could achieve if only they worked hard enough, a message that ignored the structural obstacles that prevented most black Americans from accessing opportunities like those Carver had received. He was held up as an example to be followed, as evidence that racism was not the problem, that individual effort was sufficient, an argument that served those who wanted to deny that systemic change was necessary. Carver himself seemed uncomfortable with such uses of his fame. He continued his quiet work at Tuskegee, continued his pre-dawn walks and his correspondence with farmers, continued refusing patents and giving away his discoveries. The celebrity that the congressional testimony brought was accepted with characteristic humility, neither sought nor rejected, simply incorporated into the ongoing work that had always been his focus. The committee room emptied. The congressmen returned to their other concerns. The case of peanut products was packed away, and George Washington Carver, having spent 2 hours demonstrating what he had learned in a lifetime of listening, departed the capital and returned to Alabama, to the laboratory where more secrets waited, to the work that fame had not changed and could not change. The letter from Booker T. Washington found George Washington Carver at a moment of arrival and departure. Established at Iowa State, recognized for his talents, yet somehow knowing that his story was not complete, Washington's words carried across the distance between Alabama and Iowa, carrying within their folds a summons that would alter the course of agricultural history. Washington was building something at Tuskegee. From a small normal school founded in 1880, he had created an institution that offered black students practical education, trades and agriculture, skills that would make them economically independent in a South determined to keep them dependent. The philosophy was controversial even then, criticized by those who believed black Americans needed classical education, liberal arts, preparation for political and social equality. Washington believed in building from the ground up, in economic foundation before political superstructure, improving black capability through tangible achievement. Whether Washington's approach was wisdom or accommodation, whether it accepted too much or demanded too little, remains debated still. But his letter to Carver spoke a language that transcended these debates, the language of need, of service, of a people and a land crying out for help that only certain knowledge could provide. The black farmers of Alabama were trapped. Sharecropping and tenant farming kept them bound to white landowners through cycles of debt that never ended. They planted cotton because cotton was what the landowners demanded, what the merchants would accept against their credit, what the entire economic system required. They planted cotton in the same fields year after year, watching the yields decline as the soil surrendered its nutrients. watching the boll weevil arrive to feast on the weakened plants, watching their debts grow while their harvests shrank. The land itself was dying. Decades of cotton monoculture had drained the soil of nitrogen, had created conditions favorable to pests and diseases, had transformed what had once been productive farmland into exhausted earth that could barely support the crops planted in it. The farmers knew something was wrong, but did not know what to do. They had been taught to plant cotton. They had been taught nothing else. Washington understood that Tuskegee needed someone who could teach the science of agriculture to students who had never been in a laboratory, who could translate complex knowledge into practical wisdom, who could heal both the land and the people who worked it. His letter to Carver was an invitation to that work, an invitation that offered little except the opportunity to serve. I cannot offer you money, position, or fame, Washington wrote. The first two you have, the last from the position you now occupy, you will no doubt achieve. These things I now ask you to give up. I offer you in their place work, hard, hard work, the task of bringing a people from degradation, poverty, and waste to full manhood. The letter asked Carver to abandon security for uncertainty, recognition for obscurity, a greenhouse full of resources for a department that did not yet exist. It asked him to take everything he had learned through the wandering years, through the locked gates, through the solitary studies, and the formal education and the patient accumulation of knowledge, and give it away to those who needed it most. Carver read the letter in his room at Iowa State, surrounded by the specimens and equipment that represented his hard-won position. Outside the window, the Iowa landscape stretched toward horizons he knew well. The fertile soil he had learned to understand, the climate he had mastered, the security that had taken decades to achieve. Tuskegee was another world entirely. The Deep South, the land of slavery and segregation, the region where black men were lynched for presuming too much, where education for black people was seen by many whites as dangerous, where everything Carver had worked for could be stripped away in an instant by violence he could not predict or prevent. Yet something in Washington's words resonated with something in Carver's soul. The child who had been traded for a horse, who had watched his people suffer under systems designed to keep them suffering, who had found in plants a language of healing. This man could not refuse the call to heal a people and a land. The decision was made in prayer, as so many of Carver's decisions were. In those pre-dawn hours, when he walked alone and spoke with God, the answer came. Iowa was not his destination. Iowa was preparation. Tuskegee was where the preparation was meant to lead. He wrote his acceptance to Washington, packed his specimens and his few possessions, said goodbye to the greenhouse that had flourished under his care, to the colleagues who had accepted him, to the students who had learned from him. And in October 1890, George Washington Carver boarded a train heading south. The journey took him through landscapes that shifted from the agricultural plenty of the Midwest to the wounded fields of the former Confederacy. Through the window, he could see the damage: eroded hillsides, exhausted soil, cotton fields that spoke of desperation rather than abundance. The land needed healing. The people working that land needed knowledge. And somewhere ahead, in a place called Tuskegee, a laboratory waited to be created. Students waited to be taught. A destiny waited to unfold. Carver arrived at Tuskegee with seeds in his pockets, dreams in his heart, and faith that the God who had guided him through the wandering years would not abandon him now. The station was small, the town was small, the institution was small, nothing like the established universities of the North, nothing like the resources he had left behind. But something was present at Tuskegee that Iowa could not offer, something that transcended equipment and funding and academic reputation, something that Carver had been preparing for all his life without knowing it: the opportunity to serve, the chance to heal, the possibility of bringing knowledge to those who had been denied it, of transforming both land and lives, of doing the hard, hard work that Washington's letter had promised. The train had stopped, the journey had ended, and the real work, the work that would consume the next 47 years, that would make the peanut famous, that would transform American agriculture, that would make George Washington Carver into a legend, was about to begin. Throughout his years at Tuskegee, George Washington Carver received letters, thousands of them, from farmers seeking advice, from children asking questions, from fellow scientists requesting collaboration, from lonely souls who sensed in this gentle man a kindred spirit. He answered them all. In an age before automation, in years when correspondence required pen and paper and postage, he wrote each reply by hand, treating every letter as worthy of his attention, every correspondent as deserving of response. The letters came from everywhere, from the Alabama farms, where sharecroppers struggled with depleted soil, from northern cities, where black families sought advice on nutrition and gardening, from India, where Mahatma Gandhi wrote seeking guidance on feeding the poor. Carver responded with detailed instructions on cultivating peanuts in Indian soil. From industrialists like Henry Ford, who admired Carver's work and sought collaboration on projects involving soybeans and alternative fuels. The correspondence with Ford was particularly significant. The automotive magnate was obsessed with finding agricultural alternatives to industrial materials: plastics from soybeans, rubber from goldenrod, fuel from plant sources. He saw in Carver a kindred spirit, someone who understood that the natural world contained industrial possibilities. Ford invited Carver to visit, sent his personal train to transport him, hosted him at his estate and laboratories, treated him with a respect that was remarkable for an era of pervasive racism. The friendship was genuine but complicated. Ford's anti Semitism was notorious. His admiration for Carver existed alongside prejudices that Carver could not have shared. Yet Carver maintained the relationship, perhaps recognizing that influence could be exerted through connection that doors opened could not be easily closed, that the complexity of human beings did not require perfect alignment of values. But the letters that mattered most to Carver may have been the simplest. The notes from children who had heard of the Peanut Man and wanted to know if they too could talk to plants. The queries from young black students wondering if science was possible for someone who looked like them. To these correspondence, Carver gave his most careful attention, understanding that a single response might shape a life, that encouragement offered could create possibilities that discouragement denied. My dear little friend, one such letter begins, written to a child whose name is now forgotten, whose question is now lost, whose life proceeded in directions we cannot trace. The letter continues with detailed instructions, with patient explanation, with the kind of personal attention that a famous scientist might have been expected to delegate, but that Carver provided himself. The correspondence reveals a man whose reach extended far beyond his laboratory, whose influence operated through countless small interactions, whose legacy was not just products and discoveries, but the individual lives he touched through the slow work of letter writing. Each response was another seed planted, another connection made, another moment when someone who felt forgotten received attention that said, "You matter, your questions matter, your struggles are worthy of response." The letters also reveal Carver's loneliness. He never married, never had children, never formed the intimate partnerships that most people seek. His life was his work, his students, his correspondence, his pre-dawn conversations with God. The letters from strangers were, in some sense, his community, the relationships he could maintain across distances, the connections that did not require the proximity and vulnerability that closer relationships demanded. Was this a choice or a circumstance? The question has no clear answer. Carver's sexuality has been the subject of speculation. Some historians suggest he may have been gay, which would have required careful concealment in that era. Others suggest he simply prioritized work over relationship, devoted himself to service rather than intimacy, found sufficient connection in the correspondence and student relationships that filled his days. What is certain is that he was alone in ways that fame could not address, that the thousands of letters he received and answered were both balm and evidence of his solitude. He gave himself to correspondence he would never meet because giving himself was what he knew how to do, because service was his nature, because the letters offered a form of intimacy that he could sustain across the distance that separated him from most human beings. The letters accumulated in his files, each one a moment of connection preserved, each one evidence of lives he had touched, questions he had answered, hope he had offered. After his death, archivists would sort through them, would catalog the correspondence with Ford and Gandhi and countless unknowns, would recognize in those thousands of letters the scope of a life that extended far beyond what any institution could contain. The letters speak still, speak of a man who understood that knowledge is nothing if not shared, that fame means nothing if not used to help others, that the real work of a scientist or any person is not the discoveries made, but the lives touched. George Washington Carver wrote letters until his hands could no longer hold a pen, gave himself to correspondence until there was nothing left to give. The letters remain, each one a seed planted in soil we cannot see, growing in directions we cannot trace, yielding harvests we will never count. The cotton fields of the American South were dying, not all at once, not in dramatic collapse, but slowly, steadily, the way life drains from anything too long exploited. Decade after decade, the same crop had been planted in the same soil. Cotton in spring, cotton in summer, cotton harvested in fall, cotton repeated until the earth itself seemed exhausted, until yields declined year over year, until the boll weevil arrived to feast on plants too weakened to resist. George Washington Carver walked among these wounded fields and saw what most could not see, or would not see, or had forgotten how to see. He saw that the soil was not merely dirt, but a living community, bacteria and fungi, insects and worms, organic matter in complex relationship, all of it requiring balance, requiring reciprocity, requiring rest. He saw that cotton, that hungry plant, took nitrogen from the soil and gave nothing back, drained the earth of the very elements that made growth possible. And he saw that the cure was ancient, was known, was practiced by farmers across the world who understood what American cotton growers had forgotten, that fields must rest, that crops must rotate, that the land is not an infinite resource to be extracted, but a partner requiring care. Crop rotation was not Carver's invention. The practice was as old as agriculture itself. Ancient Romans rotated crops. Medieval European farmers left fields fallow. Indigenous peoples across the Americas understood the necessity of rest and variety. But the Southern cotton economy had suppressed this knowledge, had created conditions where farmers had no choice but to plant cotton year after year, had prioritized short term profit over long term sustainability until the land could give no more. Carver preached a gospel of rotation, traveled to churches and community gatherings, to farm meetings and county fairs, spoke in the language of practical necessity, translated scientific principles into wisdom that farmers could apply. Plant peanuts, he told them. Plant sweet potatoes. Plant cowpeas. These nitrogen fixing crops would restore what cotton had stolen, would feed families while healing fields, would break the cycle of depletion that was destroying both land and livelihood. The farmers listened. Some of them understood, but understanding was not enough. The obstacle was not ignorance, but economics, the brutal mathematics of debt and dependency that trapped sharecroppers and tenant farmers in systems designed to keep them poor. The landowners wanted cotton. The merchants would advance credit only against cotton. The entire structure of Southern agriculture assumed cotton and could not imagine alternatives. A farmer who planted peanuts instead of cotton might heal his soil, might produce a crop, might do everything Carver recommended, and then find himself with no buyer for what he had grown, no way to pay his debts, worse off than before. Carver understood the trap, understood that agricultural reform without economic reform was meaningless, understood that the peanut, that humble legume that the soil so desperately needed, required transformation not just in the field, but in the market. If no one wanted peanuts, he would create demand. If the markets did not know what to do with peanuts, he would show them. If the peanut was seen as food for circus elephants and children's snacks, he would reveal it as something else entirely, as raw material for products that people wanted, that they would buy, that would make growing peanuts profitable. The question that would consume his laboratory for years took shape. What can be done with a peanut that will make it worth planting? The question was economic, but it was also spiritual. Carver believed that every plant contained within it possibilities that the Creator had placed there, waiting to be discovered. The peanut was not merely a legume, but a message, a communication, a secret encoded in shell and seed and skin. To discover what the peanut could become was not just chemical investigation, but theological exploration, asking the Creator what had been intended, listening for answers that came in the language of molecules and reactions. In his laboratory of salvaged equipment, surrounded by students who were learning to see abundance where the world saw only poverty, Carver began the long investigation, ground the peanuts, pressed them, heated them, combined them with other substances, separated their components, studied their chemistry, kept meticulous notes, recorded experiments, documented failures that pointed toward success. The first products were simple: peanut milk, created by grinding roasted peanuts and suspending the result in water, nutritious and cheap, accessible to families who could not afford cow's milk. Then peanut cheese, peanut flour, peanut meal for livestock feed. Each product was an argument for planting peanuts, a reason to rotate, a step toward making sustainable agriculture economically viable. But Carver's vision extended far beyond food. The peanut contained oils that could be extracted, proteins that could be processed, compounds that could be transformed into products no one had imagined possible. The list began to grow: wood stains and dyes, cosmetics and medicines, adhesives and insulating materials. Each discovery was another argument, another reason, another piece of the case that Carver was building for the peanut and for the agricultural revolution it represented. The gospel of the rotating crop was finding its commercial expression. The healing of the land was becoming economically possible. And the peanut, that humble, overlooked, dismissed legume, was revealing itself as something extraordinary, as container of possibilities that only patient investigation could unlock. Carver worked through years of slow progress, through experiments that failed more often than they succeeded, through the patient accumulation of knowledge that scientific research requires. He did not seek patents for his discoveries, did not claim ownership of what he had found, believed that knowledge belonged to everyone and should not be hoarded for profit. The products he developed were given away, were published, were offered to anyone who wished to use them. The generosity was consistent with his entire approach, with a theology that saw research as revelation, with the mission that sought to help the poorest farmers rather than to enrich himself, with the conviction that the peanuts' secrets belonged to the people who needed them most. The cotton fields were still dying, the boll weevil was still advancing, the farmers were still trapped. But in God's little workshop, something was emerging that might offer a way out, not just a crop to plant, but products to sell, not just rotation to heal the land, but markets to justify the healing. The peanut was revealing its secrets, and George Washington Carver, that patient listener, that gentle interrogator, was taking notes. In 1906, a wagon rolled out from Tuskegee Institute, carrying something revolutionary, a school that traveled to those who could not travel to school. The Jessup Agricultural Wagon, named for Morris Jessup, the philanthropist who funded its construction, was loaded with demonstration equipment, seeds, educational materials, and the accumulated wisdom of George Washington Carver's laboratory. It would bring knowledge directly to the farms of Macon County, meeting black farmers in their fields, teaching them in the language of their own labor. The idea was simple but transformative. The farmers who most needed Carver's knowledge were the least able to access it. They could not leave their farms for extended education. They could not afford to miss planting or harvesting seasons for academic study. They could not travel to Tuskegee, could not enter its classrooms, could not participate in the formal education that institutions provided. And yet, they were the ones whose lives most depended on the knowledge those institutions offered. So, Carver brought the institution to them, loaded the wagon with everything needed for demonstration: a plow, a cultivator, a churn, equipment for making and demonstrating products, samples of improved seeds, charts, and pictures showing proper farming techniques, and sent it out on the dusty roads of Alabama, traveling from farm to farm, community to community, carrying education to those who had been denied it. The wagon would stop at a crossroads, a church, a community center, wherever farmers could gather. Carver or his trained assistants would demonstrate techniques: how to rotate crops, how to improve soil, how to raise and process peanuts and sweet potatoes, how to make products from what the land provided. The demonstrations were practical, were visual, were accessible to people who might not read easily, who might not respond to lectures, who learned best by seeing and doing. The pedagogy was revolutionary in an era when education meant sitting in classrooms, taking notes, absorbing information delivered from authority figures behind podiums. The Jessup wagon offered something different: education that came to the learner, that respected the learner's circumstances, that met people where they were, rather than demanding they come elsewhere. And the results were visible. Farmers who had planted cotton year after year began rotating crops. Families who had relied on expensive store bought goods began making their own products. The techniques spread from those who attended the demonstrations to their neighbors, from community to community across the region. The wagon became a traveling seminary of agricultural knowledge, spreading a gospel of sustainability and self sufficiency across the wounded landscape of the Black Belt. The wagon was eventually replaced by a truck, the Jessup Agricultural Wagon becoming the Booker T. Washington Agricultural School on wheels, motorized for greater range, equipped with more sophisticated demonstration materials, reaching farther into the countryside. The principle remained the same, bringing education to those who needed it most, refusing to accept that geography or poverty should determine who could learn. Carver himself traveled with the wagon when he could, though his responsibilities at Tuskegee often kept him on campus. When he did travel, the effect was remarkable. This renowned scientist, this man whose discoveries were reported in newspapers across the country, would kneel in the dirt beside farmers who could barely read, would demonstrate techniques with the patience of someone who had never forgotten his own humble origins, would treat each person's questions as worthy of serious response. The humility was genuine. Carver had been that farmer once, had been poor, had been uneducated, had been denied access to the knowledge he now possessed. The wagon was his way of repaying debts he felt he owed, of ensuring that others would not face the obstacles he had faced, of democratizing knowledge that institutions tended to hoard. But the wagon was also practical strategy. Carver understood that his laboratory discoveries meant nothing if they never reached the people who needed them. The products he developed, the rotation techniques he advocated, the agricultural reforms he proposed, all of these required adoption by actual farmers working actual land. The wagon was the bridge between laboratory and field, between theory and practice, between what science knew and what communities needed. The institution Carver helped create, the extension service model of bringing university knowledge to rural communities, would eventually be adopted nationwide. The Smith-Lever Act of 1914 created the Cooperative Extension Service, formalizing the approach that Carver and Tuskegee had pioneered. The Jessup wagon was not just transportation, but prototype, not just vehicle, but vision of what agricultural education could become. The wagon traveled dusty roads, crossed rickety bridges, made its way to communities that few in academia had ever visited or thought about. It carried seeds and equipment and demonstration materials. But more than these, it carried the conviction that everyone deserved access to knowledge, that no one was too poor or too remote or too forgotten to learn, that education was not privilege, but right. Carver watched the wagon disappear down country roads, carrying his knowledge toward people he would never meet, toward farms he would never visit, toward futures he could only imagine. The image stayed with him, the wagon moving through the landscape, carrying hope, carrying possibility, carrying the promise that things could be different. The fields were still wounded, The farmers were still struggling, but the wagon was moving, was carrying healing, was demonstrating that the distance between what was and what could be might be traveled if only someone would make the journey.